Welcome to this Innovation Fund tutorial. In this tutorial, we will walk you through an example of the application of the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Calculator tool for an energy storage project. During the application for the Innovation Fund 2025 call, project proposals are assessed against several criteria. Greenhouse gas emissions or GHG emissions avoidance is one of them. Applicants must estimate the greenhouse gas emissions avoidance based on the Innovation Fund's GHG methodology using the relevant Excel calculator tool. Both are published on the funding and tender portal. If you haven't already done so, we recommend reading the greenhouse gas methodology before watching this tutorial. If you still have questions after watching this tutorial, consult the FAQs in the funding and tender portal, or contact our dedicated help desk. The Energy Storage Calculation tool comprises 8 tabs. Some are informative, others are for mandatory completion. In the first Overview tab, you can find overall instructions about the tool and the color coding to identify mandatory cells. As shown in this colored table on the left-hand side, blue cells indicate fields where any information, activity data, or consumption data shall be inserted. Light green cells indicate fields where there is a formula or links embedded. No inputs are required. Yellow cells indicate a drop-down menu where you shall select the appropriate option. Finally, gray cells are for comments and other information about the data entered. The content of each tab is detailed at the bottom of this Overview tab. This tutorial focuses on 5 main tabs. First, the 4 tabs that support your calculation, which are the Reference Emissions tab, the Project Emissions tab, the Conversion Factors ES tab, and the Assumptions tab. We will also cover the Summary tab, which is mostly populated automatically with your inputs from the other 4 tabs. This tab gives you the values you will need to insert in your application. In the Summary tab, you will also have to enter general information about the setup of the project. Let's start with a hypothetical project. In this project, the applicant proposes an energy storage project that aims to provide stacked services by an innovative battery energy storage system, or BESS. This system comprises intradaily electricity storage and dynamic reactive power services. The BESS has a capacity of 200 MWh and can provide 33 MVAR reactive power. In the drop-down for the sector, I therefore choose intraday electricity storage. For the principal product, I choose electricity. As your project is not yet up and running, you will need to adopt assumptions to predict your operational performance and to calculate your reference and project emissions. You must document these assumptions in the dedicated Assumptions tab. So, let's switch to the Assumptions tab now. For the purposes of this tutorial, I have pre-filled this tab with assumptions we will use for the calculation of our hypothetical project. The project will provide stacked services, comprising of a battery energy storage system, used for intra-electricity storage, and dynamic reactive power. To estimate the avoided GHG emissions, I need assumptions about the storage capacity, the electrical efficiency, and the equivalent number of full storage cycles per year of the battery. This should also have been evidenced based on calculations from primary data from energy flow metering. You must detail the source or the rationale for any qualitative or quantitative assumption adopted, and fill in the data traceability section. Failure to explain assumptions, or the use of unrealistic assumptions, will be treated as a serious weakness and could lead to project application failure. In our example, the battery provides energy storage and dynamic reactive power. For the assumptions on reactive power, we move to the Conversion Factors ES tab. This tab contains some default factors for ES projects, but assumptions on auxiliary grid services must be added manually by the applicant. For our reactive power example, we need to fill out the cells for R services, CCGT factor, and emission factor, EF. Here too, you must detail the source or the rationale for any assumption adopted, and fill in the data traceability section. Our services in line 25 is proposed to be 33 MVAR. In our example, we assume that reactive power in the reference scenario would be delivered by a combined cycle gas turbine, CCGT, operating at a reduced efficiency of 45% instead of 55%. The capacity of the turbine necessary to deliver the proposed 33 MVAR of reactive power is identified to be 52.8 megawatts, giving a CCGT factor of 1.6 in line 32. Based on these assumptions, we calculate the emission factor for reactive services in line 21, using equation 4.4a from the methodology, which I have already entered. Now that we have outlined our project and documented the conversion factors and assumptions, let's move to the Reference Emissions tab to calculate the emissions avoided by the project. Before you start, I recommend you go through the parameters to understand what each of them refers to. Do not feel alarmed with the number of rows. You will only have to complete those that apply to your project. There is one entry per type of energy stored, such as electricity, heat, or hydrogen, and one entry for additional grid services provided by energy storages. As mentioned before, blue cells indicate the fields you fill yourself. In our example, the electricity stored in the battery E_out elect and the hours of reactive power provision T services react are the only relevant outputs. In line 17, I calculate the annual electricity output of a single energy storage plant by multiplying the storage capacity, the electrical efficiency, and the annual full storage cycles. I put these down in the Assumptions tab. Note that I have pre-filled the cells for the first 2 years accordingly, linking the relevant cells in the formula. Copying this for all years, I end up with 36,234 megawatt-hours of electricity output in each year. For the reference emissions of the provided reactive power, we go to line 22 to put in the hours of delivering the services. In our example, this is 100 hours. The calculated emission factor is filled in cell S22. The provision of grid services has no default emission factor. The cell in line 22 is linked to my calculations in the Conversion Factors tab. Since this project is not a manufacturing project, I do not have to fill out the section starting from line 28. Now that I have filled all the parameters, let's check that numbers appeared properly in the calculation columns. To do this, go to the top of the table to check that all the reference emissions have been captured and summarized. Before we move to the next steps, I want to show you that the tab allows you to put additional information about the traceability of the data. In this field, you must provide a brief description of your monitoring plan. This may include procedures for data collection, as well as roles and responsibilities. The data traceability section here needs to be coherent with the data traceability section of the Conversion Factors and Assumptions tabs. Having calculated the reference emissions, we will now calculate the project emissions. The Project Emissions tab is organized in the same manner as the Reference Emissions tab. At the top, you will see a summary of the project emissions for each parameter. When scrolling down, you will see one row per input to the energy storage, such as electricity, heat, hydrogen, or other. In addition, there are rows for the on-site emissions from fuel combustion in stationary and mobile sources, as well as rows for on-site fugitive emissions of greenhouse gases. Again, I recommend you go through all the parameters first, to understand what each of them refers to. Now, let's start populating the cells with our project data. The electricity stored by one energy storage plant is determined in the same way it was in the reference scenario, but without factoring in the electrical efficiency. However, the calculated emissions remain zero in this case, because the emission factor for electricity consumed by the energy storage is zero by default. This can be seen in the Conversions tab. As in the Reference Emission tab, there is a data traceability section starting in column AG that must be filled out for the input data. Having calculated your reference and project emissions, the indicators informing the 2 GHG emissions avoidance criterion will be automatically calculated by the spreadsheet in the Summary tab. The absolute GHG emissions avoidance, calculated as the difference between reference and project emissions. And the relative GHG emissions avoidance, which is calculated by dividing the absolute reductions by the reference emissions. In this case, 100%. You should carefully check that these numbers are plausible and in agreement with your expectations. If all of this is the case, congratulations, you have successfully used the calculator tool. You should now use these for application forms B and C. We invite you to revisit the calculator at your own time. I hope you find this tutorial useful. If after this tutorial and reviewing the tool you still have questions, please do not hesitate to submit a question via the help desk if the answer to your question is not included in the FAQ available on the funding and tender portal. Please note that the help desk can only answer questions related to the methodology or the utilization of the tool. Our team will not review calculations or validate assumptions that you intend to use for your project. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.